So I've got this little intro thing that I thought I'd read out, which is just our little dick sucky bit for Julian, so everyone knows who he is. So we'll start with that. So it's I tell you what, reading is really not fun for me. I don't like I don't like reading.
Don't like the words.
No, they're all big words as well. Your biography is filled with large words. So I'm trying.
It's not
literally. When I was going through reading your stuff, I literally had like 2 tabs open. Like, what does this word mean? Ooh, what does this word mean?
Okay, let's go then. All right, sweet. So today we're joined by a writer, blogger, and poet whose works focus on guerrilla ontology and eco-anarchism. His rebellious practice of breaking from the collective consciousness and his spryness around ideological entrapments have led to one of his contemporaries describing him as a bag floating in the wind. In this episode, we hope to capture some of the delightful sprightliness that you'll find across his works. He's the writer of the Feral Trilogy, Feral Consciousness, Deconstruction of the Modern Myth and Return to the Woods, Feral Iconoclasm, Anarchy as Rising and Dying, and Feral Life, Meditations on Anarchists and Anarchy. And you can find his work at ecorevoltblog.wordpress.com. And I'll leave links to that in the description. So please join us in welcoming the feral badger himself, self-proclaimed conscientious cannibal, and egoist, the lovely Julian Langer. God, that was a struggle, wasn't it? Trying to get through that. I'm not used to introducing people. How you doing,
I love
man?
that word.
Nice to meet you.
Iconoclasm. What a word.
You've met me, Ben.
It's
nice for me to meet you.
Well, you've just recently obviously had an essay published in the Anarchist Library, an eco-egoist deconstruction of species being and speciesism. And I thought, because obviously you just released that, we'd start with kind of going through that and working out what you're writing about and sort of our takes on your view on things as well. Because I think it's very interesting when you actually dive into what you've put in there. And I think a lot of people would find it really interesting. Maybe before we get onto that, we'll talk about sort of what you're all about. So you call yourself obviously a guerrilla ontologist. And I think maybe I could give my version of what that means, but maybe you'd be better at describing what that is for people.
Yeah, to make it as least esoteric as possible.
How I would describe the term is guerrilla ontology means the destruction of realities, like a guerrilla practice in that it's somewhat political or politicized and somewhat perhaps you could describe it as a mode of psychological warfare from an anarchist kind of perspective. And then ontology regards kind of what is real, what is a reality, what does it mean for something to be real, what does it mean for something to be a reality, how do we define what's real, how do we consider what's real, and questions around that. And it's about the kind of, rather than kind of what could be described as political theory or political science, guerrilla ontology in a political sense would be kind of looking at the kind of fundamental ideas within ideologies. But it's not just a political thing. It could be just bringing, from a traditional kind of guerrilla ontologist perspective, it would be like bringing really radically new and engaging ideas that are different from the kind of what's a normal perspective on the world. But yeah, that's a kind of quick and easy kind of going through guerrilla ontology. I wouldn't limit it though just to thought, because I'd also consider doing things like creating art that is challenging, or doing things like, the thing I never shut up about, smashing badger traps. Those are modes of reality creation and reality destruction, and ways of relating to what is real. And I would include those sorts of activities within guerrilla ontology.
Yeah. See, obviously we've obviously gone and done a little bit of background kind of research. I know you as a person. And I've always tried to be like, oh, well, what do you think on this? What do you think on this? And tried to put you in a little box. of like, this is Julian's perspective, and you've always dodged. You know what I mean? You've always got, no, I'm not that. You know, and I think that kind of sums up when I perceive you as a guerrilla ontologist, it's for me, it's like you like to cause like dissonance in people's ideas of things and go, no, it's not quite that, you know, and throw kind of a little spanner in the works of people's ideologies, you know?
I have to challenge you there, Ben. I have to challenge you there. I don't like to cause
There we
anything.
go.
I can't cause anything. Causality doesn't exist. It was made up by some people. Like, but there's no such thing as cause and effect. So I can't say that I like to cause anything. Like,
he's done it already.
I love it.
it's true.
So you call yourself an eco-anarchist. And obviously some people go along and say they're green anarchists. You just mentioned about badger trap smashing. Is that what you would consider eco-anarchism to be, like going out in the world and changing things to make them how you see fit, if you know what I mean?
In terms of what eco-anarchism is or green anarchism, I use the word eco-anarchism rather than green anarchism. I don't even call it anarchism. I use the term eco rather than green because I don't believe in green politics, which is like sustainability stuff and like technological improvements and all that type of stuff. But so eco-anarchism, there's a load of ideologies that are eco-anarchism, so like primitivism and social ecology, and kind of different kind of ideas and theories around what green anarchism or eco-anarchism kind of means, and kind of roadmaps for society and all that sort of thing. But for me, I'm not really interested in much of that, because I don't consider myself an advocate of eco-anarchism, but of eco-anarchy, which for me is just anarchy or kind of primal anarchy or wild being or wild life. So kind of wild, badgers, wild birds, wild flora, fauna, trees. That is eco-anarchy or just anarchy. That's what that means for me.
So it seems from what I gathered that you take a much more kind of individualist perspective on anarchism. So rather than, because I did a bit of research on green anarchism, and it doesn't necessarily, I mean, it bears some similarities to what you talk about in your essay, but at the same time, there are a lot of things that are kind of fundamentally different from it. But I wanted to ask what like an ideal end goal would be for your kind of individualist views on anarchism, for lack of a better term. What would be your kind of, the ultimate goal that you could reach in terms of your actions?
For me, Rob, there is no end goal because there is no kind of beginning or end to things, and it's not about reaching a kind of utopia or a place where things are, where we've got things the right way. It's about living and surviving in a world that is absurd and is constantly kind of changing. And and for me, the idea that I can design an end goal and that people or the world needs to fit that end goal, I think that's ridiculously arrogant, regardless of whatever ideology you're pushing. And so I like the term that was kind of, I believe, created by a guy called Aragon, who goes by Aragon ! Aragon Bang, within anarchist discourse, and it's anarchy without roadmap. So it's not having this idea of here's where we're going to get to and here's where things are going to be right. It's about,
or even a past, for that matter. I remember you kind of said about how you don't see the relevance of origin stories and things like that.
Present.
So I guess it's literally like in the moment, and that's something that I actually do quite like about what you write about in your meditations and things. I do like that kind of perspective of being in the moment and not really having an end goal. It's hard for me to accept as someone who's very, I kind of consider myself a bit of a existential, like, transhumanist or something. So it's all about like the journey of humanity from where we have come from to where we are going. But at the same time, I really respect like someone like you that does really focus on that, living in the present, and kind of that animalistic nature and things. Like I can get down with that.
for me, it's life is here and now. Life is happening immediately in this body that I'm experiencing the world as and through, and the world as an extension of my body. And I've never reached a future moment. Like it's never arrived. Like, you know, and as much as, you know, we can say like the future's out there and have these ideas of what might be coming or that sort of stuff, it's like a story. You know, it exists in that abstract conceptual realm that is not physical or kind of
not tangible.
Yeah, it's not meaningful in any sense of what is, you know, I don't have a belief that we should sacrifice anything from the living present right now for some abstract future that's kind of, you know, just born out of the imaginations of some clever dicks.
I see. That's what I find hard, though, is the future thing. I almost find harder than the past, because I can see your logic in terms of we're living now, so don't worry about things that happened X amount of years ago. Now, what you just said there about not sacrificing for future, I mean, we sacrifice for the future every day. You know, you go to work, you're sacrificing your time now for future earnings, you know. I find that almost hard to grasp, that concept of, if we really did just dive into, we are just living for the absolute second that we are in right now, you know, how much could you ever sustain relationships? Because if you just said what you thought every second, or, you know, it's I don't know, we always make sacrifices, little sacrifices, but they're still meaningful in their own way. I think
within this reality, this, you know, this Leviathan civilization, whatever you want to call it, that we live in, yeah, of course, like, you know, I live within this space too. I have a day job, and, you know, and that happens, but I'm not talking or desiring that. I'm talking about, you know, what I see in the lives of wildlife I experience, and it's not about that getting to a future where we're living like them, but it's about experiencing the here and now kind of in a similar way, not the exact same way, because we can only experience in the world as we experience it, but experiencing it in a way of an intensity of anarchy that is right here, right now, like how they are, kind of how I see them living. That's what I want to live like.
That gets into, actually, quite nicely, I think, the going, you know, to your essay and about the species being section in particular, is obviously, we perceive humans and animals, you know, there's difference in all species, that we say, okay, that's that, and that's that, and that's that. But when we look at the difference between animals and humans, we say, well, animals eat, sleep, reproduce, play. And then the add-ons for humans, obviously, classically, it's that humans have reasoning, like logos, and animals don't have that. And I know I'll let you. I can see your eyes going up. Obviously, now Marx added onto that the division of labor, as humans have the division of labor, which is why we can have agriculture and, you know, food in shops that we can go and collect and take home. But I wanted to get your perspective on that sort of model of the difference between humans and animals, because obviously when you go to I guess when when we go to like our own free time, our relaxing time, that's when we would say that's our animal time, when we eat, sleep, reproduce, and play, is our free time. And then our human time is all the time that we think that we're like not being human, but they're the things that, you know, by that model would define us as human, because that's the difference between us and animals. So what's your perspective on that?
I'll try and do kind of as much of each part of what you just said as possible, kind of breaking it apart. The first bit was talking about the idea of humans having like reasoning and, you know, that sort of thing. And I believe we can say that if we accept the idea that there is this species called humanity, and that there, you know, that exists as a meaningful thing, humanity might think it has reasons or reasoning, but I'm not convinced that there is this thing which is reasoning or reasoning in that sense of, I can't say that I find any reason for anything. I can't find any reason that is the reason, the point. Why is there, you know, some justification for anything that makes it fit into some logic? I can't say that I experience that, or that I see that as something that is real. Then after that, so there was, what was the other one you did before Marx?
Oh, I said about, obviously, animals and humans share the common sort of things of eat, sleep, reproduce, and play.
Just the human things before you said.
Oh
about
no,
Marx.
yeah, I said reasoning, and I put in brackets there. I said, like, logos as the
Okay.
You were kind of referring to Plato
onto...
and like the rational reasoning, and then the emotional and the appetitive kind of.
But in terms of like the Marx thing about having the division of labor, I think that in terms of what we could say for the idea of the human-animal split divide, that perhaps, as much as I hate Marx, perhaps Marx is kind of a bit on the point in that the reason why we think that we have this split is because of the productive narratives that we culturally buy into, but as I don't see those as real things in terms of being real in a pre-performative way. It's performative, and it happens in the practice of a reality, like a theatre. Production happens. It's those actors will. The actors playing Shakespearean plays are doing all those things, but it's not a real occurrence. It's not an authentic thing happening. It is it's a production. And that's the difference to me, kind of real and reality. It's kind of, what's real is kind of animal and kind of just what I'd call wild. But but I don't believe in that split for various reasons. And I think that and with that, I don't even think that the categories of kind of human or animal kind of being separate really meaningful at all.
So do you think that potentially our reasoning and rational is an illusion, or essentially an extension of our kind of animalistic tendencies and our appetitive nature as well?
I wouldn't say it's an extension of
an illusion, really,
of our animality. I'd say it is a repression of who we are. So it's something I did in my first book in particular. I believe, it's not a belief thing. It's I experience people repressing their selves and their desires and their experience in favor of this conceptual understanding that is, reductionistic, in very much the same way that mass extinction is reductionistic, tries to erase anything that doesn't fit within this ideological apparatus of this is the way that things are and the way that things should be, even if my own experience would destroy that notion. And I think that it is a phantasm or a spook in terms of words I'd use more than illusion, perhaps.
I see.
But yeah.
Yeah. It goes along with that sort of, we almost always say, like everyone would always say, we feel most human when we're doing those relaxing things where we say we're eating, we're sleeping, we're playing, we're reproducing. That's when we say we are at one with nature, or as close to our human instinct as possible. And then when you go to work, you do feel like a cog in a wheel and not, human. The whole point of those workspaces is they are kind of dehumanizing, aren't they? They're unindividualistic. You sit in a box that is the same as everyone else's box. You wear the same clothes that everyone else wears. You're a collective as opposed to an individual when you go to work. Unless you work in a very...
Actually, I really like the point that you put in the essay that you wrote, where the comparison of goofing off at work as destroying that anthropological machinery, and you're effectively collapsing civilization in that moment that you are engaging in an animalistic kind of activity of just denying the system and not working. I like that comparison. I think that was really cool.
It's a little... civilization is always collapsing in those sorts of ways that people don't want. I don't think people want really to be human in terms of, and just I don't find the workplace, Ben, as a dehumanizing space. I think that's where we do the productive performance of humanity kind of most intensely. but those moments where there is active and joyful dehumanizing happening, where it is just that, like I used to, when I worked in an office for a while, I used to just dick about all the time, every moment I could possibly get, because that was just an immediate way of me kind of going, I'm alive. I'm not just this horrible thing in this horrible space, and I'm not one of these beings. I'm me, and that was a
So when you go on to the kind of coming away from that then and saying we want to be as human or as animalistic as possible, I always got the impression, and I think maybe I've got this wrong with you, is I always saw your viewpoint of sort of the feral life or something along those lines as being kind of that desertionistic kind of approach to things, where you would go and live in the woods and not see anyone else. But I don't think that's actually your perspective, is it? And reading that,
you mean like primitivism?
Reading that essay, it kind of it made me think that my view on your opinion of things was wrong, which I found interesting.
So I do critique both desertion ideology, which is different from primitivism slightly, and primitivism. And I'm sympathetic to a lot of the ideas in both. Primitivism, my main critique of it, and I am planning to write something this year on where I agree with primitivists and where I disagree with primitivists. But primitivism, my main critique, and the one that I put in that essay, is that it is kind of a anthropological reconstruction and kind of productive kind of narrative, in the sense of like theatre productive narratives, and it doesn't arrive kind of out of necessarily kind of instinctual, here I am, what am I going to do right now sort of thing, but it's one of the critiques it's often put on social media is that it's like LARPing, and then with desertion, the book Desert, and the invitation to desertion, written by one of my contemporaries, Bellamy Fitzpatrick, it is very, in a very kind of quite sad way, it's very promised land thinky, in that it's got this idea of, here's where we get to, here is the place we're going to get to, and I think that that's a really crap way of thinking, in a similar way to how I was answering your question earlier, Rob. And it's also kind of, with the desert one, it's also kind of patheticness to it, where it's just like, it's like there's no kind of desire to to rebel or be or engage in creative destructive practices that can be beautiful and wonderful, and there's no real celebration of the joyous aspects of of those experiences within that kind of ideology. So I find that kind of a bit weak and pathetic.
You use the example of...
I'm not a kind of...
Sorry, I was going to say, you use the example of the Israelites, going off with Moses to find the promised land. Is that a way that you'd look at it, as a way that you could do desertionism with multiple people? And because I always get the impression that it feels quite lonely, that you're separating yourself from a society. But would you say that a utopian society would be one that was sort of desertionism? If you looked at cults, would you say they are in their own way kind of desertionists, or would you say that's a completely separate thing?
Desertionism is its own kind of different thing, and I'd say that, and I don't know how people who read Desert and kind of get into those kind of thoughts, how they would plan it out and plan out their kind of utopian desert life, if that's how they put it. There is a slight pessimism that goes with the kind of desert ideology, which is kind of perhaps kind of less inclined to utopian thinking, but there's still that kind of aspect of perhaps like a utopian trace of kind of the promised land there, but it's I don't find any value in it, and I don't think that. I think cults are different in the sense that I'm guessing you're meaning kind of thinking kind of Osho style cults where we're going to build our own kind of thing out there, which is.
It's what we're trying to build with this podcast.
Is it? Supreme leader Bob, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
we're all about neo-Marxism right here.
We're not. We're definitely not. Bob might be. He wants UBI, but we don't.
I'm interested to see how it came about that you kind of created almost this way of thinking which doesn't necessarily fit any kind of predetermined ideologies that are already out there. I'm really intrigued as to find out what your journey was to get to this.
So
I've not told him to ask you that either. That he's come up with that off his own back. Because his journey is very interesting. It's probably.
I'll do a quick version of the true story, but I won't go into too much detail. So it's like things like the experience of a dead mum and a dad who's not there because he's an addict, and then living in between different religious households and like family households and different political ideologies within my family. And kind of a sense of identity crisis throughout my young life that went on all the way through into my kind of older teens and into my 20s, and it's still somewhat there in me today because I don't really believe in whatever I call my identity. But like it's those experiences, and then reading things from a Marxist perspective throughout my early teens, then reading things from what would be kind of a social anarchist kind of bit later on into my teens, then post-left stuff. And then the most significant thing was being a cancer patient and undergoing brain surgeries and radiation therapy and being in a car, moving between those spaces of the hospital and home and being engrossed in like music and TV, and then feeling this sensation of my body and the kind of the split between that. And doing kind of reading environmentalist and like philosophy and philosophy of technology stuff, and doing kind of looking into different psychology theories and different aesthetic theories and perspectives, and reading lots of stuff and spending a lot of time reading, a lot of time meditating, a lot of time walking. When I had the fitness to walk after my cancer treatment, going and walking through the countryside and on roads and experiencing the roads as scars that have wounded this landscape that I am part of and that is an extension of me and that I am an extension of, and then finding between fields these beautiful spaces of wildlife happening and these trees and these things that are alive and in a way that is just so much more intense than we kind of, that we really see. And then going into like to the edge of my world, which is Devon, because I live in Devon, and going to the like cliffs and feeling this sense of here is a stop and here is this primordial sea that is so powerful, and how cosmically tiny I am and how insignificant I am and absurd and bizarre, and having those experiences and having debates with people, and it all kind of, and it's not that I've, in terms of like, obviously I've created in the sense that it's come out of me, but it's not like something that I constructed or I built or I planned out or designed. It's something that I experienced, and and just, I could try and make that fit an ideology, but that would be dishonest. And for me, like, I might be an arsehole at points, but I'm an honest arsehole.
Unlike me and Ben, if you've seen our last episode.
I'm not commenting.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, yeah, that's... So what would you say were some of your influences, maybe, perhaps?
Influences?
In that? It's like, maybe, yeah, kind of in terms of philosophy and things.
Yeah, influence... So a huge one, Albert Camus, and another huge one, Friedrich Nietzsche, and then Thoreau, Zerzan, and there's people like other Giorgio Agamben. There's aspects where I'm somewhat influenced, though kind of in a perhaps negative sense, where I'm influenced by him through my disagreements with him, but like Zizek, and then there's a bit of a awkward one to admit because people always throw this one criticism my way, but Heidegger, and then there's Max Stirner and Renzo Novatore and Emma Goldman, and just I could list off different people, and like,
because that's the kind of like vibe I got, is there's like there are concepts from each, there seems to be like a little bit of nihilism here, and then but not too much nihilism, because I feel like you do take meaning, don't you? Like you see meaning in things.
Wouldn't call it meaning. I see power and beauty in things.
Right.
And I call myself an absurdist, which is like a nihilism who doesn't just stop at the absurdism. I think is nihilism that doesn't stop and wallow in its own self-pity. I find absurdism as a nihilism that just goes, yes, it's all absurd, yes, it's all meaningless, but fuck it, I'm alive and I'm going to do this thing because I am it.
Just accepting the absurdity of that you're just basically like committing to a meaningless search for answers in a answerless world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about Marx, I think you should because, and this is a funny one. So I've had this conversation with you before about Marx, where I came to you at one point and I was like, I'm really into communism. I was quite young, Julian, and you were like,
I think everyone has that phase, though, don't they? Where just when you look at communism, and you think it makes sense, it should work.
But I would say now, post that kind of, I don't know what it is, that kind of overtly like liberalist kind of feeling of like, oh, I'm this or I'm that, and trying to box yourself. I would say now that I feel like I've been vaccinated from Marxist kind of ideology. Do you have that as well, where you just every time it comes up, you just go, ugh, no, like you could never get that sickness again. You know what I mean? And I think Bob's still there.
Is this directed at me?
It's me asking. Yeah. It's me asking you to rinse Bob.
I'm not a Marxist.
So in terms of my perspective on Marx and Marxism, in terms of politics, I think it's undeniable that Marxist politics has been a fucking tragic, just horror show, which somewhat Marx is responsible for, and then also Marx never set up gulags and he never committed genocidal atrocities, so I can't blame him for it. I think there's a lot of, in terms of Marxist theory, there's a lot of good criticism that's come out of Marxist theory, like people like Jacques Hamat, who I'd probably consider like the best Marxist theorist, particularly with his kind of almost accelerationist type perspectives, is really valuable. And in terms of Marxism, there's something valuable in that space for criticism, if not that its politics, even in kind of its kind of libertarian forms, is something that I just find, like, if nothing else, if not just horrifically violent, then horrifically boring, because the libertarian Marxist perspective is essentially have meetings all day where we democratically make decisions all day, and it's just meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, just for total democracy all the way down, which just sounds hideously awful as a way to do life. But I think that, yeah, in the sense that Marx based his philosophy in Hegel's philosophy, though he kind of tried to take it from rationalism into materialism. But Hegel is essentially a totalitarian thinker, in that everything has to be synthesized dialectically into the thesis that is the collective or whatever, in terms of putting it to Marxism. So everything has to be subsumed into this collective thing, which is a horrible idea, and undeniably shit. But in terms of critiques of capitalism and things, and critiques of aspects of this culture that is largely, capitalist, there's a lot to be taken from Marxism. But in the same way as, you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, like, meet Marx on the road, then fucking stab that guy in the face quickly. Like, that's kind of the way I'd put it.
Cut his beard off. So when you say about that with the collectivist stuff, I feel like anarchy in itself, like when you think about like Antifa or like people like that, they seem to be collectivists. You know what I mean? Like they don't seem very individualist. When I look at groups of anarchy, anarchism. Well, you see what I mean? It's the distinction between, obviously, yourself. You'd call yourself. I know you don't necessarily call yourself, but you've done, obviously, in your feral life stuff about anarchy and anarchism. But you also are very individualistic, and you're very like about the ego and not about the group identity. So, do you think that's the problem with anarchy or anarchism, where it's so sort of dominated by
in anarchist discourse? There's always been an individualist kind of aspect to it, and in terms of what how you can call like Antifa or like similar projects, as much as they might be doing the rhetoric of collectivism for kind of the ideology that is anarchism, anarchy is an experience. And I say this as someone who's rioted before, or just the experience of doing kind of direct action is an individualist occurrence. Even if you're doing it in a tribe of other people, sharing that thing, but it's not. I don't find the idea of collectivism in any way compatible with the experience of anarchy. So you can do a rationality, and you can kind of reduce, practices down, like, free food stores. You can try and reduce that down to a collective thing, but that's not what's happening. And there's a lot more nuance and subtlety to it, and things are a lot messier than the kind of nice, easy way of doing things of, we are massive people together and we do this, we can beat this thing. Things are way more harder than that. And I think the push for collectivist stuff within anarchist discourse comes from a kind of desire for comfort, because the kind of collectivist position, which is very kind of almost kind of Christian in quality, or kind of, in those kind of Abrahamic religion style quality. Like it's very comfy and nice, but there's an honesty to what the experience of anarchy that I encounter as individualist and not collective. And in terms of the way that I position collectivism, what I generally mean by collectivism is like statism or societyism or civilization, which I see as anarchy as being something outside of that is trying to repress.
So, because obviously anarchism kind of, almost strives for the destruction of hierarchy in general, social hierarchy. And then so with green anarchism, you're kind of striving for the destruction of all human hierarchy and kind of domination over life in general. And obviously from your individualist perspective, I was interested to kind of find out what you thought about in nature when certain animals act in what could be considered in a collectivistic way. So like for example, ants and things, like where the ant will value its own life as less than the life of the colony. Would you see that as acting in a collectivistic way?
No, I simply no. I in terms of taking the ant colony example, I would put that as individual living beings desiring, they're actively pursuing their will to life and their desire for life, desiring creativity and in a way how they encounter the world and those they encounter the world with, doing things out of their will to power as something that is life striving, not machine striving. So the ants' activity is engaged in the world as something that is a creative process. There is not a machinery that they are subservient to. So you take the machinery of like architecture, or the machinery of the plow, or the machinery of trains, or whatever, but things that this culture has positioned itself as dependent upon. Collectivism is subservient to those machinery, those technological apparatus, which we consider our lives dependent upon.
Hammer and sickle.
The ant has embraced, without repression, its desire for life, not necessarily life as a reductive thing of just this body here, but seeing its life as an extension of the world and part of the world, in an individualistic, selfish, egoistic way of seeing itself as the world and its desire for the world's well-being as part of its well-being. I don't see that as collectivist personally. I can't say for the ants' experience.
No.
I can't tell you that, and I wouldn't. Anyone who I think would claim to know an ant's experience, I think is utterly ridiculous. But I see I see that as individualism.
What about, so I know we're bringing up Jordan B. Peterson again because everyone loves him so much, but when he talks about value hierarchies, he compares, and there's a controversial comparison of lobsters to humans, where he talks about that they're organized in a hierarchical fashion based on competency, and the top 1% controls more resources than the bottom 50%. So I was interested to hear your perspective on that as a natural example of hierarchy again.
So similarly, I wouldn't call. I don't see the lives of lobsters as hierarchical. They might have leaders, but a leader is different from an authority from my perspective. And Jordan Peterson has no fucking idea what the experience of being a lobster is. He doesn't have any awareness. We might culturally, because some scientists told us this, frame the lives of other living beings as hierarchical. That is a linguistic enframing that a bunch of experts have placed upon living beings with, in a way that is just completely like.
I guess that's what it all boils down to, really. It's us thinking that we have the right to kind of categorize things to our standards.
Yeah. Well, whereas just to do the thing on leaders, so I notice that leaders arise kind of without need to repress, without need to kind of coerce or try and control, very, very, very organically and authentically. My favorite example is elephant matriarchs. But that is not an authority or a control complex, because anyone can leave, anyone can walk away. There's nothing tying them, binding them to the collective. It's a tribal relationship of individuals choosing in that space freely to be there and sharing this experience with these other living beings. But that's not an authoritarian thing. That's not a hierarchy, and it's not a collective. It's individuals, in experiencing egalitarian community. From my perspective.
So, what's your? This is relative. I mean, we're kind of on the speciesism thing here, aren't we? So, I kind of had a question about that in terms of when you think about. I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear your reasoning on sort of when you have conservationists who are engaging in like population management or culling. How do you think that is completely anti-nature, or do you think that is useful in a way to keep the entire ecosystem in a balance, or do you just think that you should just let nature reek through it and just do its thing?
It's not a should or a shouldn't thing for me. I don't claim to have knowledge about how the world should be or what people should do, where they live, and in environments that I have no meaningful kind of tangible relationship relationship with. So I'm not prescriptive, and I'm not trying to reduce the frame of conversation to these are the right things to do and these are the wrong things to do. My experience is that I desire what I'd call feral culture. So kind of would be just like a rewilding that is free from management and kind of controls and ideas that come from people who consider themselves experts or authorities on the way that ecosystems should be, and it just happens as it will do. Like, people talk about invasive species, but then the first animals to walk on land were an invasive species. Like, and I have that desire, but I wouldn't. With that, I'm while I can say that I do find there to be a slight ugliness in a lot of conservation work, like, I'm very anti-cull just from the offset, but just in terms of a lot of the cull practices, conservation practices, sorry, I do have a kind of an instinctual thing of some of it I just find gross, but I'm not going to say that I can say that it's right or wrong, because the world's far too messy for me to be able to say what is right or wrong, or what's the best course of action in a place where I have no connection to.
Yeah. No, that's fair.
Yeah, I think that links to kind of again, or emphasizes the individualistic kind of properties of what you're talking about. Because in the little short video that you did where you were talking about your book, you were kind of saying that food consumption is based on a location and the resources that you have available to you. So it's kind of like everyone, no matter where they are, basically lives to their individual nature, which reminds me of that Albert Camus quote, which is the literal meaning of life is whatever you're doing that prevents you from killing yourself, which kind of, I feel a lot of that in what you're saying. It's really down to you as an individual, rather than where you're not kind of pushing anyone towards any kind of goal or anything. It's just down to that person and how they want to live. Freedom.
Yeah, there's a lot of prescriptive kind of, we have the answer, we have the way that things should be kind of thinking within particularly radical discourses, and I find that ridiculously arrogant and fucking annoying. Like people of a kind of primitivist perspective will be, everyone should be hunting and gathering, and just go, well, where in the world can people live in your ideal frame of mind? And then vegans who it's everyone needs to eat this way, and you just go, no, because there's not going to be one right way of doing things for everyone.
Yeah,
I think that's probably the issue I had when I first started to get an understanding of what I thought was your version of feral life, which I think is wrong, which is quite funny now. But obviously I thought that you would be sort of going along that kind of like, oh, everyone should be just living in the woods and like get rid of all this and that. But I don't think you are, and I think it's very easy for people who don't read you all the way through, or don't have a full understanding of your perspective on things, to look at what you're doing, even just if they looked at the titles of things and feral life and feral iconoclasm, and and think, oh well, he just wants everyone to go and live in the woods. But it's not as simple as that. You're saying, for me, that is what your version of an ideal is for you to be as close to nature as possible for you, and you're kind of saying, well, everyone's got their own version of what's beautiful to them, and just go and do that, which makes sense. Maybe I fucked that up and didn't say that very well.
I think that wildlife is happening in this room right now. Wildlife is happening in this room. I live in a barn conversion bungalow in the middle of the Devon countryside, between like 4 patches of woodland, like a comfortable distance away from any town. And this could be considered a very domesticated space, but compared to a flat in London, it's a very, it's much more intensely wild. But
as Bob will attest
to, in my room, who knows what's going in here? I'm in a flat in London, and I argue that mine's probably more wild than yours.
would mean the environment generally, but in terms of like even in your body, Rob, there's a lot of wildlife in there. Most of what comprises you is wildlife. It's not you.
Yeah.
There's those little things on your eye right now, eating away.
Yeah.
Microscopic organisms.
Yeah. No, I like that idea of being close to nature. I guess you could say I'm on from what Ben was kind of thinking that your feral living was about, and that like, oh, let's go live in a cave and things. I guess you could put me on the opposite end of the spectrum, kind of like where you compare primitivism to transhumanism, and I'm kind of like more. I don't like the idea of forcing anything upon anybody at any time, and I like the idea of being, anyone can be able to be liberated from whatever kind of construct they're underneath, but at the same time, like, I want cybernetic implants and things like that.
Bob also believes that everyone is inherently good, so he would trust the person implanting it.
My pessimism is where I lose you there, Rob, and my lack of belief in good and bad.
Yeah.
So I always get this topic in my head of something I want to look into and read into, but I never have managed to like grasp it properly in a way that I could ever like explain. So when you talk about the ego or egoism or egoists, how would you define that for someone like me? So explain it like you would to a 5-year-old. From a basic understanding, from a basic understanding, what is the general idea of that?
Okay, I'm going to direct this at Bob. Okay,
the 5-year-old.
Okay, Bob. Okay, because you in the Taoism bit, you did some stuff that's related to this, but you are the ego. That's you, but before the concept of you, before the idea or the name of you, you are the ego. So your egoism is youism. You're desiring, your processes, it's your practice of being you. You are the egoist. There is no, all other egoisms they're just concepts and like abstractions and spooks. Your desires, that is egoism.
Purely kind of self-centric.
Yes. And then for me, in terms of what I call eco-egoism is that in a sense of self which is non-reductionist, which expands and includes the sense of the world being part of you and you being part of the world. And so my rational self-interest, my own rational desires or irrational desires, subject-sensitive rationality, I should say, that is my egoism. So my desire for life, of my own life, is a desire for the life of the living beings who I encapsulate my tribe or the space that I'm in, which in a non-reductive sense is the entire bloody world. Eco-egoism for me it's very similar to what you'd call deep ecology, but the difference is deep ecology has kind of like a transcendental holism or holism, whereas eco-egoism is a reversed holism, which is subscendent rather than transcendent, where it's not reductionism, but a kind of smallism, if that makes sense. It's a drawing kind of, it goes downwards but doesn't erase or kind of negate. Yeah.
So, and where you touched on holism there, that was actually brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you as well. So essentially, like when it comes to nature and biology, as Hank Green puts it, basically biology is just have sex and don't die, or try not to die. So do you not think that kind of almost from nature's perspective, it looks at us as like through a holistic lens, almost, as the fact that it doesn't really care so much about the individual. It triggers chemical reactions in our bodies that give us an incentive to keep the species, or our naturally predefined stereotypal category, if you like, to keep that going.
Okay. So first point. So biology is a concept made up by a bunch of scientists. It's an idea. It's an ideology. It's a set of ideas that people wrote down and that a lot of people believe in, but it's not the world.
I see. So that's reductionistic in the sense.
It's a perspective by experts, and it's a reality. But and there's a degree to which I value that reality in a lot of ways, but it's not what's true or what's real. And then in terms of your question about nature, if that category of things, nature exists. Nature is not something that's looking down on us like God, or
not like a sentient kind of deity or anything. Yeah,
you are nature. I am nature. Everything is nature. It's not a dualism where there's nature out there and nature is watching us and nature is thinking bad humans. I am nature judging this culture. You are nature, experiencing this world, and there's in terms of whatever nature wants, what nature wants is my experience of what nature wants is what I want, because there is no separation between me and nature, and nature and me, just as much as what Bob wants is what nature wants, because there's no separation between you or nature. It's just who you are. And in terms of my rejection of biology there, I would say from a biocentric point of view, you can say that everything is just sex and food and life and death in that sort of way, where we kind of disregard lots of things. But if I consider myself as a biological entity, as a thing that fits within that field of reference, that biological being is immersed in an ecological situation, and is an ecological situation because I am an environment to a huge amount of living beings that live within me. And that does not detract from the egoistic experience, because that is all one thing that is just being this person, this individual that I am. And for me, my biocentrism, I know from knowing me that I'm not just a set of drives that perhaps Freud and some other people who consider themselves an expert on who I should be because I fit into this category of the human. I don't embrace that idea for myself.
Do you like pottery?
Do you like pottery? I love playing with my shit then all day, every day.
You're going to have to link that so people know what that's about.
Basically, Freud said that doing pottery was playing with your poo as you're a grown-up.
Oh, amazing.
Brilliant.
Oh, God. I think that's probably a good place to end. Before we do end, I did just want to say epistemological. I did want to say that word at some point on this.
I wanted to say epistemic responsibility, like and into what you believe in, because it was W.K. Clifford that said it's wrong always and everywhere to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. But I believe that you've provided sufficient evidence, so I can't use that.
All right. Thank you, Julian. You've been a star, mate. I think we're gonna have to do more of these with your other kind of essays and books and stuff that when we're coming out. It's been amazing. Thank you for your time. We've had a lot of fun. I hope you've enjoyed it too.
Yeah.
And we'll speak to you next time.
I've enjoyed it, and time is an illusion. It doesn't exist.
Yeah. There you go. Julian Langer, everybody.
Cheers, man.